So I wanted to do a little deep dive into mind control and propaganda. So these things are the same thing. Like, so if a government or institution or a corporation or a person is propagandizing, I think the correct way to view that is that they are also attempting to control minds. They're attempting to control the way that minds are. And by controlling the mind, then they're thereby controlling the actions. And if the mind control is strong enough, it effectively constrains movement and behavioral patterns to the same degree that a prison would, or a physical restraint. So really effective propaganda, or really effective mind control is as effective or even more effective than physical restraint, because you can restrain minds like with very little resources, whereas if you're trying to physically restrain people, it would require a lot of space. Or if you were even going to try and eliminate, or if you can get permanent propaganda or permanent mind control, that is essentially the equivalent of killing somebody. Because if you're going to kill somebody, you're trying to get rid of their innate or their natural behavioral patterns permanently. And so if you can get somebody permanently propagandized, that's the tactical or military equivalent of a kill. So again, that's it's much quieter to propagandize, and in this day and age, it's a lot easier because of the way that narrative technology is developed, and the ability to saturate a person's environment with a propagandized narrative is greater than it ever has been before. And so with the communication technology and media, you can get people in a permanently propagandized state, like millions or billions of people. And so that's a much quieter military operation than trying to kill millions or billions of people, and it accomplishes functionally the exact same thing. So the way that mind control works is through false narratives. So you get people in basically a hypnotic state or a delusional state, to where they think that something is happening that is not happening, and it's not just one thing, but it's an entire narrative or an entire worldview. That's how permanent propagandization works, is that you're not just trying to lie or promote like a particular fact or something about a particular situation. It's an entire worldview. It's like an entirely false or entirely artificially generated worldview, like an entire fantasy. And to do this, you have to tap into primal instincts like fear, isolation, repetition, peer pressure. Like, there's all these tactics that were studied, and so you can do these things to get people to adopt particular narratives. The main thing, though, that gets somebody to be mesmerized by a narrative, because humans don't actually operate via their intellectual faculty in their natural state. So a human in their natural state is looking at the world through their heart, and they see truth directly via intuition. And so to get somebody to stop using their heart and to focus on their mind, which is where you can upload a narrative. You can upload a narrative into a person's mind and get them to respond to that narrative, right? And I don't have to give specific examples of this. We all know exactly how this works. Like we've seen it. So I'm just talking about how you get the false narratives in. How you get somebody to respond to the false narratives. I don't even need to really pick out any particular false narrative. But if you get somebody to adopt a completely artificial worldview, again, that's permanent, lifelong behavioral modification. So if you can control that worldview, you can control everyone who has adopted that worldview. And so the way that you bypass intuition and direct knowing through the heart is two ways. One is pride. So you get somebody prideful, judgmental. You get somebody to want to basically become powerful with their ideas or weaponize their ideas, or you get them ego identified with their ideas, with their own intellection. You get them to start worshiping their mind. It's not even necessarily anything in the mind, but you get them to start worshiping their mind. So you incentivize mental worship, which you could just call that pride, because the ego or the idea of the self is the mental self-image. So if you fall in love with your mind, you're also going to fall in love with your self-image, and we call that pride. And that makes when somebody falls in love with their ideas, it makes their ideas much, much more real. It's basically a delusional psychosis. It's a delusional, when you're in love with ideas, you're a psychotic fantasizer, and you'll get emotional gratification from fantasy and fetish. So that's one prerequisite for propagandized mind control. And then the other one is heart damage. So the heart has to be damaged so the person stops wanting to reference it for truth. You could do this physically, mechanically. You could give people some sort of substance that damages the heart, that causes it to become inflamed. You can do things that damage their cardiovascular system. This literally damages intuition the same way that lie would damage the eyeballs, where you can't see anymore. So you can actually cause yourself cardiovascular damage. So this can also be done via diet. Cholesterol deprivation, getting people to eat trans fats instead of normal cholesterol. A high sugar diet combined with no cholesterol damages the cardiovascular system. Right? And there's other ways. There's certain substances that you could inject that create proteins that damage the cardiovascular system. Behavioral patterns where you're breaking the heart over and over and over again. So, like polyamory, promiscuity, things to where you're getting people to fall in love in an untenable situation, so that their relationships and the people that they love end up hurting them sort of over and over and over again. All of this stuff numbs the heart and makes people not want to reference the heart for truth. And the heart is a very perceptive organ, so all this stuff can kind of like stack. So once the heart is damaged through lifestyle choices, dietary choices, or different types of medical treatments. You can also damage the heart with electromagnetic radiation. Like the heart generates an enormous amount of electromagnetic waves. There's a big old EMP, and so all of those waves are entangled with each other, so you can actually bombard the human energy system with erratic, noisy, uncomfortable EMF, and that'll also cause the person to not want to look at or reference their heart field. They won't want to look into that heart field by which you can directly sense truth. So if you combine, all you can use your imagination. There's a lot of different ways to damage the heart, and to damage the heart as a sense organ. So if you do that, and then you combine that with pride, getting some sort of self-infatuation, some sort of ideological infatuation, that makes the ideas seem like real, and it's the only thing that gives you sort of an emotional response, or kind of a truth response. Suddenly becomes the fantasy, suddenly becomes the idea. So if you can, then you'll have people like with no heart sense, and then with a hyper-developed mental sense and a hyper-developed sense of fantasy. At that point, the person will be blind to intuitive, common sense sort of truth, and then they'll have to rely only on the narrative. So if you can then have the person surrounded by, you could essentially present multiple different narratives. And then if the person's heart sense is blinded, they have to rely on narrative to navigate reality. And if they're surrounded by narratives, they have to pick one or piece one together. And then suddenly, if they're using, they're all false narratives that are controlled, or easily changed, manipulatable, interactable. So then suddenly the person's behavioral patterns, thought patterns, movement patterns, lifestyle patterns become based on all of the different available artificially generated narratives. Then if the narratives can be controlled, right, if you only have to create 5 or 6 different narratives, and then if those narratives are saturated and thrown out into the world and everyone's heart is damaged, they have to adopt one of those narratives or a combination of those narratives. And at that point, you're only having to manage 5 or 6 different narratives. But those 5 or 6 different narratives can end up permanently propagandizing billions and billions and billions of people. So in terms of cost management or resource management, this is much easier to manage, a half dozen or a dozen narratives, and then control those narratives, especially when they're interacting with each other. And then as people adopt those narratives with a blind heart sense, then they're essentially become permanently propagandized. Like literally with the physiological damage to the heart, like they become physiologically dependent on the propaganda to make any sort of sense making, because then without it they would have massive amounts of anxiety. So it's much, in terms of warfare, or just management of bodies, right? It's much more effective than outright killing or imprisonment, because you would kill somebody so that they don't act a particular way, and if you can permanently propagandize them or permanently mind control them, they will not act that way, even if they live their full life. So you've essentially taken an opponent off the battlefield. And so this weapon is actually astounding when you really look at it. If you look at it in a pragmatic way, the ability to neutralize billions and billions of people, and like literally with no cost or cleanup or anything, like and you can even get them to work for you. So not only is it the same as just killing somebody, you can then turn their corpse, like somebody that's been permanently propagandized and their heart's destroyed, they might as well be dead. But then not only have you killed them, but you can actually get their body to work for you, to say, kill any of your remaining opponents, or to work against them, or to do whatever you would need them to do. And that's just kind of how modern warfare works. It's a warfare of the mind, because it's so much more effective than a hot war or all-out war. And then it's primed with. There's a little bit of a physical interaction, because you do have to destroy the heart, and you do have to get the person addicted to their mind, or addicted to their mental self-image, or addicted to their thought forms, and then that makes their fantasies more palpable than reality. So then they respond to their fantasies more than they respond to reality. So there's a little bit of actual physical priming, but then the rest of it is all just kind of information management. And then you can do these things to greater or lesser degrees. So sometimes you can like set off a propaganda narrative, almost like a nuke, flooding the whole world all at once with a combination of factors that causes like massive uptake on the scale of billions of people all at the same time. Pretty cool stuff. I mean, if you're into weapons, it's cool. It's clever.